Good afternoon. Our topic is a vast one today if we're going to examine the development of the experience of freedom in modern and contemporary art. And it's even more vast because we're going to be obligated to go back into the 19th century to see where this developing experience began. And I'm going to begin today with two iconic paintings of the early 1800s, both of them French. And the first one you see, the painting of Eugène Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People of 1830. This is an example of one mode of an approach to experiencing freedom in art and through art. What we have here is an image representing not the French Revolution of 1789, but rather the so-called July Revolution of 1830. Which deposed the Bourbon monarchy. What's important is to see how Delacroix has used the image of liberty, what would later become Lady Liberty, around whom all the various combatants against the monarchy have gathered. Some of them have died, some of them are struggling, others are wounded, and if you look, you see almost every class of society, from the reasonably well-to-do to the most impoverished. What Delacroix did there was something that had only begun to emerge in France at the time of the Revolution in the 1780s, the idea of making liberty incarnate in the form of a woman. We're used to this today with our Statue of Liberty given to us in the 1880s by France, but this was a new development. Of course, the Greeks and the Romans had used female figures to embody certain mythic qualities, such as victory, but this was something new. And you see that all the forms develop around her and that the colors of the French flag, the tricolor, the red, white, and blue, are distributed throughout the painting. So this is an example of several paintings we will look at where freedom is depicted, liberty is depicted in a specific event, which the work of art celebrates. But there are other images as well. And I'm going to take you back from 1830 to 1819 to a painting by Delacroix's teacher and mentor, Théodore Géricault, called The Raft of the Medusa. This is a painting about an historical event, wouldn't be called historical in France, a tragedy, in which a ship called the Medusa sank off the coast of Africa. Almost everyone on the ship was lost, except a small number of people whom you see depicted on this improvised raft. This painting was carefully researched by Géricault. He interviewed the survivors and even created his own raft off the coast of Normandy to try to imagine how he would paint this. On the surface, it has absolutely nothing to do with liberty or freedom in art, either its celebration or seeking it. But as a matter of fact, it is one of the most revolutionary paintings that had been done in France up to that time. But with our modern eye, we wouldn't see it. And this is an example of art which isn't about a battle or a victory of liberty, but where the internal mechanics of the world of art is operating to free the artist in order to develop new grounds and territory. And what Géricault is doing here is to rebel against the constraints of neoclassical art, which had been dominant from the mid-1750s right up to 1819 when he painted this. And I will point out very briefly some of the things which we would miss that are so shocking about this painting. He deliberately shows many of the bodies, some of them dead, in the form that Michelangelo used in some of the lower registers of his painting of the Last Judgment. But some of the bodies are upside down, projecting toward us. This was unacceptable in the world of French art. There are bodies that are mostly nude but only partially draped. One that is nude but has a sock on it. This kind of thing was not acceptable. There were what the French call the bienséances, those things that sit well. And in the world of art, none of these things were accepted or permitted. In addition, several of the bodies which have not gone overboard because they've been either engaged in the wood of the raft, or in the case of the father on the left of the painting who cannot release the body of his dead son, rigor mortis has set in, and this had never been shown in art before. In addition, the painting was of an enormous scale, and this was absolutely forbidden because paintings of a large scale were reserved for monarchy, for history paintings, for mythology, and for the Bible. And so by taking this event, which did not fall under the category of history painting, and exhibiting on such a large scale, was an enormous slap in the face of all the conventions of art up to that point. Finally, two other more subtle points. The disaster of the ship was the result of a royal appointment of a captain who was incompetent but was getting patronage. And therefore, in painting this, he was implicitly criticizing the monarchy. In addition, and that was simply not something that had been done at that time. And the final point is people would know in the story that the survivors, the 11 who finally survived, did so because they had to resort to cannibalism and eating some of the cadavers in order to survive. This was a subject utterly taboo, even in terms of raising the specter of it. So here we have a painting which on the surface as we look seemed to be about a shipwreck and people trying to survive, but was actually enormously subversive in order to free art up so that it could go in new directions and be free from the constraints of what had been a very proper neoclassical art. Many of the paintings that I'm interested in looking today fall more into this category, where artists are working within an artistic tradition and that the search for freedom is taking place within the painting itself and relates primarily to the world of art, not to the world of politics. And so I'm going to begin to move in a moment, to the first movement that reacts against this romanticism, which is realism. But first I want to ask, what is the point this afternoon of following the pursuit of freedom in art? Are we merely going to see this afternoon an almost never-ending series of reactions and counter-reactions in art and its movements over the centuries? And the answer is no. There is a larger point and hopefully an insight to be gained from this survey. Art is one of the central continuing experiences of the human race. It would seem that as early as human beings first gathered, they created art. We see this evidenced by the prehistoric paintings known as cave art, some of which date back to easily to 40,000 to 30,000 years before Christ, and every year earlier art is constantly being discovered. Thus we can safely say that art is one of the central continuing experiences of the human race. It would appear that as soon as human beings gathered, they created art. And that centrality of art to the human experience is beyond dispute. The search for and the struggle for liberty or freedom in art is a constant reality in art, and this is significant because it reveals how fundamentally central the pursuit and experience of freedom is to basic human experience within the creative act, within the creative world of art, and obviously outside of the realm of art. As we see unfold this afternoon these varying artistic struggles for freedom and to experience freedom in art, we are also seeing a very much larger basic human reality. Because artists are seeking new freedom from perceived forms of artistic tyranny or oppression, artists often explore directions and forms of art that make us uncomfortable. Some of their art may shock and even offend us. But the serious artists never produce their art for the sake of gratuitous shock or offense. Their art is never created specifically to offend, and this is certainly true of every artist whom we will look at today. Those individuals who create art with the primary intention of drawing attention of mainly shocking or merely offending individuals or society are not really artists at all, and invariably their art does not survive the test of time. Without exception, they do not enter the canon of great art. By contrast, serious artists seek freedom from first, freedom from, but it is always with the intention of moving to the stage of freedom for. But artists, in their love of art and in their pursuit of absolute freedom, may, nonetheless, somewhat shock and offend. The Australian art critic Robert Hughes's 1980 study of modern art was very aptly entitled "The Shock of the New." But I think this is all put into perspective by Pope Benedict in some of his remarks that he made when he gathered with artists in Paris not that many years ago. And this is what he said, and I quote, "Indeed, an essential function of genuine beauty is that beauty gives man a healthy shock. It draws him out of himself. It wrenches him away from resignation and from being content with the humdrum. It even makes him suffer, piercing him like an arrow, but in doing so, it reawakens him. Beauty pulls us up short, but in doing so, it sets us back on our path." It is my belief that the art that I will be showing this afternoon does exactly that. And so I return to the survey right after Romanticism. And the one point I will make is that of the artists we're looking at, there are so many artists and art movements that deal with this issue of freedom and experiencing it in and through art, that this is a very personal presentation. I could have made this presentation with an entirely different group of artists. So your favorite artist may be missing, and someone you can think of that really should be there, because within the limits of time, I've chosen really a very few. The other thing that I will do is my approach this afternoon will be something of a kaleidoscope. Any one of these artists would merit our entire hour together. And in fact, several of these paintings could merit the entire hour. My approach will be rather simply to indicate certain signposts. I'd like to map, if you will, a roadmap for your future investigation by sometimes looking very briefly at a painting or an artist or even a group of artists. And I begin with the Realists in France. The great freedom which the Romantics such as Delacroix and Géricault had discovered, after a while began to appear as a form of tyranny to younger generations of artists. Their feeling was that the art was grand and glorious, but extremely removed from day-to-day experience. And so began the movement in France and spread throughout Europe of realism, as we see here in this painting of Gustave Courbet. Of course, realism is a much larger movement in literature and in all the forms of art. And while Courbet was painting in France, we had realist novelists such as Balzac, Stendhal, Flaubert, and Zola, who were doing the exact same thing. And what they were doing was to try to bring art down to day-to-day realities, to things which, again, the bienséance of French art did not seem as suitable. And so in this 1849 painting entitled Burial at Ornans, Courbet paints the funeral of his grandfather in the local town of Ornans. A subject such as this had been deemed inappropriate, not universal enough for a subject in art. And what we have is a rural, very rural, middle-class funeral depicted of average people. In addition, he refuses to beautify the scene, and at the moment in which the coffin is being brought in from your left, and we see the gravedigger ready to receive it, something has happened on the right, and almost all the women are distracted and looking the other way. If this were a photo, it would be a disaster. And even the man's dog, symbol of fidelity, is not watching his master's coffin being brought in, but is looking the other way. So we see this attempt to show what we would call the slice of life or the day-to-day reality. This painting, and others I will show you, created enormous criticism and stir. They were seen as enormously threatening to the order of things. And if, as we look at this today, we feel, what's the issue? It tells us how needed that particular struggle for a new freedom in art was in terms of topics when it was done by Courbet in 1849. His colleague Daumier, who primarily did political cartoons for newspapers, paints the famous third-class carriage. one of his rare paintings, in which we have the first painting of the interior of that rather still new invention, the railroad train. And what we see, not in first class or second class, but in third class, is a family of 3 generations with a grandmother, mother, and children, some of them probably factory workers, traveling from here to there. And we need only to look at the central figure, the grandmother's face, to see not the tiredness of a day, but of a life of work. We see in the back the rather empty stairs of the people commuting there. And every time I see this, it reminds me of the F train, which I take to work rather often. Things have not changed. But this was considered shocking to be showing these sorts of average people in paintings that were also deemed, in terms of size, too large for the subject matter. I brought several images of death by Manet, but I've decided this afternoon to concentrate on one, because Manet was one of the great continuers of this tradition, and one of the issues he tried to do was to strip death of some of its romantic emotionalism. And the one I'm going to show you is a painting in our Metropolitan Museum called The Dead Christ. And we see Christ taken down from the cross. We see him attended by angels. But what struck contemporary viewers was how dead Christ looked. He had stripped the painting of all of the spiritual comforts and consolation which the viewer had become accustomed to in traditional art. The somewhat grayish color of the body. And of course, what Manet was really doing was, in a theological sense, pointing out that this was the God-man, but a real man who died a real death and was truly dead. But this painting created enormous agitation, and it was a part on different levels of trying to bring art down to a freedom to show the day-to-day, what later became known as the slice of life. It quickly transposed here to America, right here to New York City. America was always traditionally very attached to the realistic and traditional image and the portrait. And here in New York City, working out of the tradition and the inspiration of Courbet and Manet, the group called the Group of Eight, also known as the Ashcan School, painted these New York City street scenes. This one by Robert Henry, just after the turn of the century. And they became known as the Ashcan School because they often depicted office buildings, brownstones, tenements, street scenes we hear in New York with a little slushy snow, and very often in front of the buildings would be the ash cans that had been put out to be collected from the ashes from the furnace. This was a freeing up of American art to begin to do the same thing that was now being practiced in Europe, to let art also deal with day-to-day realities, even people's ash cans. Or you had his colleague George Bellows, who particularly loved to paint wrestling and boxing, which, although legal, was something of an underground sort of entertainment, which he brings right front center to us in the painting. We become sort of ringside in this painting as we see all the sweat and effort. And these were subjects which art, both in Europe and America, had never broached, particularly with such force and such energy right in front of us. So these were very revolutionary works, and they permitted a kind of freedom for artists to deal not only with grand subjects, but with day-to-day reality. We come to 1900, and I show you this 1906 portrait of Pablo Picasso. What I love about this self-portrait is that he seems so self-assured. It could easily be said that Picasso was the first great internationally known painter, European painter of the 20th century. His father was an artist, and the story is told, whether true or not, that in his teens he said to his father, "I'm going to become the first internationally recognized painter of the 20th century," and he did. Whether the story is true or not, I think we see in the portrait the sense of self-assurance and determination. And of course, this new freedom which the realists found became for Picasso a kind of tyranny, because it insisted on the traditional ways of showing and seeing, in fact, even more day-to-day and platitudinous realities. And what Picasso wanted to do was to free art for a new way of looking and a new way of showing. He definitely did this under the inspiration of his avowed mentor, Paul Cézanne. And we know that he is one of the inventors of Cubism, and we see this beautiful, it is really beautiful and powerful face, which he paints in 1907. Cubism, the beginning of Cubism, in which he has begun abstraction, the simplifying of form, the reducing of detail, and only giving the essentials, but drawing also upon the inspiration of his mentor Cézanne, he geometricizes the form. For him, this was opening up, at the turn of a new century, a new way of seeing and a new way of depicting. So, for example, he was able to do the traditional female nude, which had, in a sense, almost been exhausted as a subject for art in a Cubist vision, an old subject in a new and exciting way, such as his famous Demoiselle d'Avignon of 1907, which you can also see here in New York at the MoMA. But there was an additional freedom which he accomplished by his Cubism, and it was a new freedom in terms of space. Artists had been obsessed with perspective, really going back to the times of the caves. The Renaissance had developed aerial perspective, atmospheric perspective, multiple point perspective, one point perspective. And what he's able to do in Cubism is to open, as if it were film, multiple perspectives from above and below, from the left and the right, in a way that had never been experienced in art. And it takes a while standing in front of a Cubist painting to realize that in some ways we're looking down on the nose, and some ways from the left, certainly from the right, and a little bit from down below, and that this is true of most of his figures. He opened up, he was one of the first, and really the first since the Italian Renaissance, to experience a new spatial freedom in art that allowed multiple perspectives. The image is often used, it's as if he painted the painting on a mirror and then cracked the glass a little bit, and you get these multiple views. And so this marks the beginning, it's now not so much content as technique of a new approach. He does portraits with his Cubism, and we see the multiple angles with which this figure is viewed. This sculpture in the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, and one must really look at a Picasso sculpture, I believe, and walk around it to understand the degree to which he had freed art from one and multiple point perspective, as you see the different angles that he's able to create in the figure, the still life, and even the landscape. Contemporary with him, however, there were artists who were less concerned about the formal concerns of art, which certainly had been freed up by Picasso, as about the emotional or expressive content of art. And we call these the Expressionists. In a very true sense, every one of them are disciples of Vincent van Gogh. But I've chosen to look at the German Expressionists of 1910, 1915, particularly Emil Nolde, who here is also drawing on a form of abstraction, but it's not geometricized. We have Christ among the children. And what he has done is obviously very much to reduce the form of the faces and bodies, to let the color communicate not so much the appearance of Christ as the interaction with the children. And so these are artists who wanted to claim back from the precision of 19th century realist art and from the techniques and mechanics of Cubist art, the emotional content, and to do it primarily through abstraction, through simplifying form, but not simply to do it, but in order for a greater expressiveness to the painting. And so we're able to get the general protective bending over figure of Christ and the reaching out of the children, and we're not distracted by the details of Christ's hair or of his arms or of the children's faces, but we see the forms interact. And then we notice the vibrant red color, the burning color of the children's need for his attention and affection, and the calming blue of Christ, who calms them and reaches out to them. And then, very interestingly, on the side, the observers in the shadows, be they apostles who are observing and still trying to understand, or cynical observers who simply do not believe in the work that Christ is doing. Emil Nolde's crucifixion in many ways shocked those who saw it because it lacked the specificity and the detail of traditional crucifixions, even as late as the 19th century. But by simplifying the form of Christ and his face, by simplifying to some degree the forms of the mourners and the soldiers gambling for his garment on the right, there is an emotional impact on the totality. The scarlet red of Christ's garment, representing his blood and his passion. The enormous grief, represented interestingly by the colors of green and white with Mary and Mary Magdalene. And the extraordinarily interesting form of the soldiers, particularly the joyous one, playing dice in order to win his garment. Here, the emphasis is not on depicting, but on our feeling, on a new experience of the crucifixion as we stand there, and the simplified forms allow the color to communicate what we can feel, or the potential of what we can feel. This is a new freedom which art has, which it did not have in more traditional pictorial representations. I show you just one other German expressionist painting of a street scene in Berlin with its staccato geometric form. It's not a very welcoming scene. It suggests urban street life in Berlin is somewhat impersonal and cold and menacing. And because we don't have enormous detail in the faces, we get more that sense of the crowd and it's the tenor of street life in Berlin. For Salvador Dali, painting in the 1920s and 1930s, what he wanted to find was a freedom for a new source of content, not in the way he paints, and I'll comment on the technique, but rather the content. And he turns, of course, to Freudian psychoanalysis, and he discovers the world of the subconscious, the dream world and the world of subconscious, and really launches the movement of surrealism. This is a seeking by the 1920s and 1930s of a new source of subject matter, and also a new way of showing old things. We have here in our Museum of Modern Art his iconic painting, The Persistence of Memory, which if you have seen it, is amazingly small when you see it for the first time. You'll notice that it is painted with an extraordinary precision of detail. There is no innovation here in technique. In fact, in many ways, he draws almost on the techniques of Renaissance painters. And the reason is he wants to convince us of the reality of the dream, and therefore no abstraction whatsoever. But the innovation, the freedom that he seeks, is drawing on another field, which is psychology and psychoanalysis, to open up subject matter for art. And some of it is interesting, because in this iconic painting, he deals with one of life's essential experiences, which is that time slips away. These melting watches, which he developed in many other paintings, were we to take one, it would ooze through our fingers. We couldn't even get hold of it. And who has not experienced that, increasingly with the decades of life, that sense of the passage of time? He's dealing with an issue of the human condition. And so this art also, which has often been dismissed, and certainly was at its time, as a gimmick, he's set free by drawing on a new source for content to delve in some of his paintings to some of the most fundamental issues. Another of his paintings is called The Human Condition, and I think this is one that he really should have entitled that way. He has mysterious images of the concrete and the dead tree and the bugs crawling on the watch, and what people usually think is a whale that's been beached, but actually it's a little symbol of his own eye closed. So there are many things that don't make sense as in a dream. But this was also a major form of seeking to free art for new directions and depictions. And what I want to do is fast forward to the 1950s for two of what I think were the greatest religious paintings of the mid to late 20th century, both by Dali, his famous painting of the Last Supper and of the Crucifixion. The Last Supper is in Washington, D.C. And I will avoid the temptation to analyze this extraordinarily powerful painting, serious and religious, but because he draws upon the dream world, he's able to show us the Christ of the Last Supper, but also the Christ of the Crucifixion and the Ascension. He's able to show us the inner room in Jerusalem and the shores of Galilee where Christ preached. And then If you look at the hairstyles of the apostles/priests, you'll see it's very much 1950s, and that they are priests at the table because they are bowing in recognition of the Lord, whom the apostles didn't fully even understand at that point. Only freed from the constraints of formal art by drawing upon psychoanalytical technique is he able, after Leonardo da Vinci, to paint a Last Supper which is new, inventive, but also spiritually nourishing. And he does the same thing with the series of crucifixions. While Mary may seem to be dressed in a 1940s hairdo and in a costume more appropriate for the stage, the floating Christ and the cross becomes a butcher block and reminds us of the slaughtered lamb, and is a very, very, very powerful evocation of the sacrificial nature of the crucifixion. And so my point in showing this is how that attempt for a new, revolutionary, and freeing approach to content and technique opened up many possibilities and freed him late in his career for what I believe are two of the most powerful religious paintings in the 20th century. Artists almost avoided doing the Last Supper after Leonardo. They would make copies of his and sign their name simply saying, "I cannot top it." And here we're shown by Salvatore Dali that there's possibility of other communication. I want to return to the movement toward abstraction. And we're going to look at three iconic works by the Russian painter Vasily Kandinsky, all of them entitled Winter. This beautiful painting, which may look as though it's in watercolors, but it's not in as oil, might be seem very consistent with the work that we saw in Germany by Emil Nolde. Winter is communicated by the bright, vibrant colors of the blue. The form is abstracted, so we just get the basic trees. And we're not so much being shown the details of winter as being helped to feel it or to experience it. I think one of the most important paintings of the 20th century is this 1911 painting by Kandinsky called Winter 2. To me, it is an extraordinary work of art because he has reduced, we have something of a ski slope or a mountain range with a few trees on obviously a very cold day with snow around. He has reduced the scene to the absolute minimum so that we can recognize that we have snow, a slope, mountains, and some trees. He has taken abstraction about as far as it can go. And by abstracting the form, the staccato lines suggest the bracing nature of the air and the snow around. By simplifying, I'm able not to see winter, but to feel it. And the colors, the bracing blue, yellow, red, and white, make me feel winter, combined with the forms. To me, this painting is the ultimate success of abstract expressionism already in 1911, and I consider it a great masterpiece. When I opened the door this morning, after a very mild winter here in New York, that's what I felt when the air first hit me this morning as I came out. It's feeling winter, not seeing it. There is a freedom here from image and from traditional depiction which allows, in a sense, an experience of winter that more traditional art never permitted the viewer. But I bring you 2 years later to 1913, Kandinsky's light painting. Here, Kandinsky has taken, we are just at the limits of how much you can abstract a painting, and here he removes the image. There is no object in this painting. It is the first non-objective painting. And by non-objective painting, we mean there are no recognizable objects. When we go back here, we have to admit that what might look like a hair is a tree. It's an abstract tree, but it's a tree, okay? And we begrudgingly admit it. But here, no, there are no images. And what he has done is to free art into pure color, line, shape, and form. And it begins to be called non-objective art, if you will, the ultimate form of abstraction. But in addition, it is beautiful. The artworks I have been showing you move me by their beauty, whether I'm looking at Nolde's depictions, whether I'm looking at the winter scenes we just saw, or this. They are not only works of an attempt to create and experience freedom, but they are objects of enormous visual beauty. And his goal here is to free art from everything that might limit communication. Therefore, there are no objects that might be Chinese or Italian or French or German. There is no iconography, there is no setting, and it becomes truly international. Remember, at a time when they were beginning to seek an international language, and we had the creation of Esperanto. This is to be international, pure communication. And in a work he publishes at the same time, called On the Spiritual in Art, Kandinsky reclaims the idea that a great piece of art is like music. When you put the music on or listen to it, the reaction is immediate. It needs no lecture, no notes, no professor, no study guide. When we listen to music, it either moves us or it does not. It is direct. And this is what he's trying to bring art into, to be a visual form of music. This is a very important turning point. And this marks one of the fine examples of an artist freeing art from, in order to have art be free for, international communication. I will just mention in passing that it is this painting that inspires the development of modern architecture, where little by little from buildings, all the cultural details and sculpture and references and materials disappear until we're given a structure of pure form, glass and steel, international style, which could be put into any city or any nation speaking a universal language. This is a very important moment in art. All of this is brought to America. When we last looked at America, they were enacting, we looked at the Ashcan School, and now with Georgia O'Keeffe, who divided her time right between here in Manhattan and New Mexico, she begins to bring this movement of abstraction and also an interest in geometry. It's as if Georgia O'Keeffe brought all the different movements in terms of form into her painting. Her very iconic paintings of the mountains in New Mexico, and very often with the bones of animals that had died, in which the forms of the bones play off the forms of the mountains. And I often thought her mountains were very stylized until the first time I visited New Mexico and my mouth fell open, because there they were. These were Georgia O'Keeffe's mountains. More realistic than we might think, but nonetheless abstracted enough to bring out form. So O'Keeffe begins to open American art to the experience of abstraction, but also primarily of abstraction, but also in terms of form. Her famous series of irises. And the thing about her particular effort to experience freedom is this: she had a limit. She would not let go of the image. She would abstract, and did so primarily, increasingly, by closer and closer views of flowers, but never would she let go of the image. And so her experience and experiment with freedom in art was the degree to which one could create color, line, shape, and form, abstract the image, but remain always with the recognizable image. And if you follow the iris series, you see this. They're not abstract creations. We get closer and closer to the interior of the flower. And of course, she's drawing upon the work of her husband, the famous photographer Alfred Stieglitz. We see this in her depictions of lilies as well. And even in the Radiator building, 41st Street, in which she takes the building and abstracts its form. Now I want to return to a painting which I'm sure you all know, extremely iconic, but also one that's more in the mode of our first painting, which was Liberty Leading the People, a painting that celebrated the need for freedom from oppression. And of course, it's the famous Guernica by Picasso, once again of 1937. What is depicted here, many people know, the bombing of the Catalan town of Guernica, which was basically carried out in collaboration between Hitler, Mussolini, and the fascist forces in Spain of Franco. It was the first major aerial bombing, and Hitler was helping Franco because the forces resisting him were, to a large degree, being taken into the town of Guernica. And the idea was to bomb the town to warn all of Spain that they should not shelter or take in the resisting forces. Hitler helped for a very simple reason. he was doing a dry run of his blitzkrieg and wanted to see, with the Air Force he had assembled by 1937, what would it be like to bomb a town. It was one of the most savage and crass acts of the 1930s. And it was complicated by the fact that the time they chose was on the weekday at noon, when they had the vegetable market once a week, filled with women and mothers and grandmothers who would bring the children, the little ones who were at home, not yet going to school, and the bombing took place then. Mostly women and children, innocent civilians. And Picasso creates this painting, and you see in it the carnage. You see the children, the dead child in the arms of the mother. You see some of the animals which were there to be sold at the market, but some of them are also mythological. And he does it, by the way, in a different form of Cubism, because he is discovering a new freedom within that movement. It's not analytical, where he shatters the image, but synthetic, where he brings it back together. And also using, if you look, the collage, where he has actual newspaper accounts of the bombing, and it's glued into his art. It's not the first Cubist painting in which he did this. So this is one of the great political statements. It's a plea for a different kind of freedom from absolute oppression and from the crushing of individuals, innocent individuals. Little did he know how much it was a prelude, his plea for decency in World War II and all that would follow. But I want to make a comment about it beyond the painting itself, which is so important as an expression of a plea for freedom from oppression. After the painting was done, it was such a powerful object that it could not remain in Spain, because Franco won and the painting would have been destroyed. And you may know that it was shipped briefly to England, where it was very briefly exhibited, and then came to New York. And by an agreement between Picasso and the Museum of Modern Art, this painting remained and was to remain in the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, until such time as Franco was dead and that there was a government or a regime which allowed free expression of art. The first time I saw this iconic painting was here in New York at the MoMA. And as you know, once Franco was dead and the monarchy was restored and Juan Carlos was in power, with great ceremony, this object was returned, where you can now see it in the Reina Sofia Museum, just a block or so behind the Prado. That whole process tells us the degree to which a work of art can represent issues about freedom, political, human dignity, to a degree that is sometimes unimaginable. This was an important and powerful work of art. We want to come after the war to New York. And if we're going to continue our examination of art being free, we left it with abstraction. We left art with the beautiful work early in 1913 of Kandinsky, the light painting. We have Jackson Pollock. What Jackson Pollock with his action paintings did was to take abstract expressionism another step forward and to make the painting now, if it had not been almost totally about art. Of all the paintings I'm showing you, if there is one that does not translate well to an image, it's a Pollock. Won't you know that you have to be in front of the Pollock to see the texture of the paint on the canvas? So almost any reproduction, even in a fine art book, one might look and shrug one's shoulders and say, what is all that about? But if you stand in front of these paintings, they are of an extraordinary textural beauty. And there is level of depth and perspective within it. But the painting becomes, and what he's done is to free painting another stage, that painting is free to be about painting. And the subject is about the paint. And not only about the paint, but how it was created. Because in his action painting, in which Pollock flung the paint, all right, but also sometimes came back and painted very, very carefully details, the subject of the painting becomes the act of creation. And you'll sometimes see people in front of a Pollock painting doing this. They're starting to sway because they've gone into the movement of the paint. And this is an enormous step forward, hailed by some, but criticized by others, who might say the problem is this new freedom is becoming a prison in which art is about art, and for some might only interest those who paint. I would disagree with that, but it's sort of a two-sided freeing art of, because it is certainly true that the subject of art becomes the creative act itself. And it was seen as a freeing of art from what was viewed as content that was often too extraneous to the creative act. So Pollock made an enormous contribution in terms of exploring the limits and the depths of what painting can do. His contemporary Rothko did something very different. What his paintings were about in color field painting, Rothko rejected the idea of the grand gesture, gestural painting, and rather was interested in color field, in focusing in a single color or two, and calming it down. The painting is still an experience of color and paint, and it's a freedom from content and narrative that usually mark painting, but it is a freedom for. Because in concentrating as he does on one or two colors, it enables the viewer, and certainly the artist, to enter within it and to experience a new spiritual dimension of reflection. Anyone who has stood before a Rothko painting knows that there is, as you look at this, perspective. There are shades of color that stand one before the other. There is depth, and most of all, that the color, there is light, and it comes from inside. These paintings glow from inside. This is the type of art that is probably more demanding on the viewer than any of the art we've looked at this afternoon. And it is the art that one most likely or most readily could walk past if one didn't understand that one has to enter into it. And we can certainly say that for Rothko, it was a means of spiritual exploration, spiritual depth. If you look at this field of blue, the many levels of texture and perspective, the shading and the glow from within. It is for this reason that Rothko was asked to create the beautiful chapel in Houston, in which he created these rather dark-colored paintings for spiritual and religious meditation. And one might look and say, so little? You have divested art of so much of what we saw, the story, the images, the content. But he has done it so that in the simplicity of the presentation, one can enter in and have an experience far beyond a narrative which an artist may want to give us. I'd like to discuss this issue of freedom in art now from a slightly different perspective. I've been showing images that celebrate the struggle for freedom, as in the Guernica. I've been mainly showing you images where the artist is dealing with the interior constraints on art within his own mind or her own mind or within the world of art. But I'd like to talk about freedom in terms of an artist's career. And I present to you William Congdon, about whom I would love to say much more this afternoon, but I will make this comment. William Congdon, we see here one of his paintings of New York City, was ranked with Jackson Pollock, with Rothko, with the action painters of the 1950s. His own work was a form of modified action painting, highly abstract, extremely inventive, obviously expressionistic in this view of New York City, which is a veritable explosion of energy. He would incise with the knife into the canvas and into the painting. And then, because of the authenticity of his vision, Congdon made two decisions. He felt called to leave New York and to take up permanent residence in Italy, where he spent the rest of his life. And in doing so, being part of that group, of the New York group, and being as acclaimed as was Jackson Pollock and Rothko and others, he broke a code or a tyranny, and I will call it that, a party line, that one did not leave the city, and one certainly did not leave America, but he felt called to do so, remaining an American and an active artist. And the second thing that he did, after being highly abstract, he returned to the image. And he began to paint. I happen to show you a religious painting, but many paintings, highly abstract, but with the image. And this broke the principal tenet of the party line of the abstract expressionists, which was simply one did not return to the image was gone. He did it out of a personal integrity, This was his freedom. And here I show you just one of an incredible series of crucifixions which he did. By their abstraction, by the limiting of detail, the power of the crucified Christ is better experienced than in some of the more traditional depictions. But he paid the price. He was totally neglected in the New York critical apparatus from that point, and his reputation less known in America than it would have been if he remained within the confines of what was expected of a New York action abstract painter. William Congdon's life is a testimony to the struggle for freedom, and that sometimes artists have to break with what is even a comfortable life, full of acclaim, in order to do what is authentic. And I wish that the time would permit us today to examine this extraordinary art in more detail. But this is another angle of the issues of freedom. I would recommend to all here a look at an entire group of artists known as the Harlem Renaissance. These artists, such as Jacob Lawrence and Romare Bearden, celebrated the emerging freedom of the African American in an affirmative way through art which participated in most of the movements of the century, abstraction and expressionism, but also celebrating the gifts that they had, the work ethic which they brought, and then subtly commenting on the somewhat subtle structures still present in society which limited their freedom, whether that was freedom economically speaking, freedom of mobility, freedom for education, or whatever. And I just show you, first of all, Jacob Lawrence's whole series called The Workers, in which we see people working in a laundry, and carpenters, and shoemakers, an enormous series in which he simply celebrated the skills of the African Americans. He moved from that to a series called the Migration Series, and here we see from the South, people going to Chicago and New York, to the great city centers in St. Louis, bringing with them the skills and the talents which he had celebrated in early paintings. And his colleague Romare Bearden, in a very powerful painting in the 1950s, simply showing people receiving the greatest form of preparation for being freed, education, all in the library studying. So I would highly recommend anyone interested in the study of freedom and social issues in art to look at this enormously rich movement called the Harlem Renaissance. We come near the end of our survey. We're coming down now to the 1960s, and of course, Andy Warhol. All of these forms of abstraction, where the images were greatly reduced in terms of precision, or even non-objective art, action painting, color field painting, they had been seen as the ultimate form of freedom, but to a new generation of artists, they were seen as an oppression because the figure was proscribed. We just mentioned the price that William Congdon paid, critically speaking, for the return to the figure. Artists like Andy Warhol, with his meticulously painted Campbell's soup cans, reclaimed the image for art. And it was a kind of new freedom, an old one actually coming back, for the image and the specific image. And Warhol's genius, having been in advertising, was to show us some of the great iconic images of our own mass-produced society. One of my favorites is this 1968 Coca-Cola bottles. Coca-Cola, the ultimate American product, whose secret has never been revealed. Many of our military secrets have been found out, but not the secret to Coca-Cola. This is the ultimate American product, mass-produced, lined up, stacked up like our skyscrapers. And I am utterly convinced, although it was much maligned, and he was, when he painted images such as this, that 200 years from now, some art historian will be saying, you see, audience, this was America in 1968. This is exactly what they were. And the genius of these artists, as every time they are freeing themselves from something before, it is not freedom just from, but for. And he uses this freedom of the rediscovered image, I think, to mirror certain consumerism issues of our society with which we are still dealing. His colleague Jasper Johns does it from a different point of view. He paints flags that are so well done with paint and caustic wax technique that the object becomes synonymous with the canvas, and when one sees it, one wonders, should one look or salute? Because the object is being restored. And he does this with the targets as well, adding also plaster casts of body parts at the top. These are artists who are now reclaiming the freedom to show the object. Richard Estes, what is called photorealism in the 70s and 80s. Paintings that are more realistic than photos, in a sense. It's almost a harsh realism. But I've had students ask me, to what point these paintings by Richard Estes? He's trying to help, with his colleagues, liberate art from what was perceived as a tyranny of not being permitted to celebrate the object and the view. I wish to end with performance art. This is Marina Abramovic. Marina Abramovic has spent her life exploring the ways in which art could be freed even further. And the question she and other performance artists ask is this: is the work of art independent of you, the viewer? Is it possible that the work of art cannot be complete until you participate in it? Not look at it, but participate in it. Does a work of art have to be on a case or in a case or on a wall? Does it have to be in a museum? Could it be on a street? And this is an exploration of her life which has been quite serious. Several years ago at the MoMA, she had an exhibition. It was really a retrospective called The Artist is Present. And what Marina Abramovic did was to sit in the MoMA at this table from opening at 10 a.m. till closing at 6 p.m. or 8 p.m. for over 4 months, all day. And you could come and sit opposite her. The only rules is you could not approach her or touch her. You could talk to her, you could make faces at her, you could fall asleep, you could do whatever you want, but the work was not completed till you were on the other side of the table. And for those 4 months, non-stop, people came and sat opposite her. Now, some will say this is utter madness. But do you see really what Abramovic is doing? She's raising questions to which we may have an answer of no. What are the legitimate limits of a work of art? And what is the place of the viewer? You see, this fellow came, he had a little shopping bag, he put it there, and he was really engaging her directly. By the way, she never moved, all right? She just looked. No matter what one did, she just looked. And on my many visits, what I was fascinated by were the hundreds of people who stood sometimes for hours watching her watch someone else, so that the work became like a ripple effect in the pool. I would go upstairs and look at art and come down, and the same people were standing exactly transfixed where they had been an hour ago, and some sat on the ground. I took some of these photos from up above. Day after day, the artist is present. Now, I'm going to tell you that there were in other rooms of this exhibition some art that would trouble most of us. Some of it we would find offensive. But I can also say, knowing this artist's life, it was not created for that purpose, that this is an artist of integrity. And as I mentioned in my early remarks, when artists are pushing the limits of freedom, they will often make us uncomfortable and sometimes even offend our deepest sensibilities. But I think we're called to take the larger picture and to see if the questions they ask are in any way valid. I would like to end with some very simple conclusions in 2 minutes. Art is always associated with liberty. Whether it's our own Statue of Liberty of 1886 given to us by the French government, and here in the city of New York, a statue, a piece of metal so charged with associations and memories, particularly for every immigrant who came into the harbor and saw that first, or whether it's the Freedom Tower, art will always be associated with the struggle for and the experience of freedom. By the way, there has been an executive decision that this tower will not officially be called the Freedom Tower. It's going to be called One World Trade Center. But I think you know, and I do too, that it will always be called locally the Freedom Tower. Architecture, sculpture, painting because it's a part of basic human experience, will always be dealing with issues of freedom and liberty. And what does this Freedom Tower represent? Freedom from? Freedom from terrorism? No. We cannot guarantee that we will be free from terrorist attack. Freedom from fear, yes. Hopefully, freedom from hatred as well. I hope that our brief survey this afternoon has shown simply this, that art has always depicted great moments of the search and the capturing of freedom, that art always celebrates freedom, that art has always supported freedom, as in the Guernica, but most of all, the creative artist in every single work of art enacts freedom. Thank you.